This is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm Giovanni Pangenda. This season is focused on talking about race with teenagers and each other. Whether you're leading in an ethnic-specific church, in a multicultural ministry, or a majority-white church, these conversations are relevant to the world your teenagers are living in, and we made this series with all these realities in mind. We are so excited to share this episode with you today. Our host is FYI's Executive Director, Dr. Kara Powell, and we have two exciting guests, Propaganda and Dr. Alma Zaragoza-Petty. But before we get to that, let's listen to what some young people had to say about race.
My name is Joshua Lee. I am 16 years old. I like to, say that I'm Asian American because no one really knows about Indonesian Americans. I like to say that I'm Asian American. And that has helped me form bonds with other Asian Americans as well, like other Filipinos. I mean, I think that's the closest thing I have to, Indonesian culture, because it's kind of similar, but very different as well.
My name is Nisha Kimber, and I just graduated high school a couple years ago. People don't necessarily know. I'm actually mixed. I'm half white and half Indian. So some people think maybe I'm, half white and half African American, or half white and half Hispanic or something like that. Or maybe they just altogether think I'm Hispanic. Like, I've gotten that before. I mean, usually they just ask, or they'll say like, oh, are you? And then they might start speaking to me in Spanish, who knows? But then I have to tell them, no, I don't speak Spanish fluently, sorry.
My name's Osvaldo Valenzuela. Most people know me as Ozzy, and I am in 10th grade and I live in California. If you focus on the good things that have come from that culture too, that would be really great, because it starts to work out the way somebody views a different culture. Because it's not then in the context of your own culture where you're comparing the two, but you're just looking and seeing the true nature of a different culture.
Hey everyone, I'm Kara Powell, the Executive Director at the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm so excited about our theme for this podcast season, which is how important it is to talk about race with teenagers and with each other. Now, we know that this can be a tough subject for any of us, but we're willing to tackle it, and we know you are too, because you know how important it is for our faith, for the church, for us as adults to serve young people, to be willing to have these hard, good, honest conversations. And especially given what we know about young people today. According to US Census data, 50% of those under 18 are young people of color. And the other 50% of those under 18 are white. So given all that, today we're going to talk about the importance of being aware of our own social location and how we need to do our own work as adults when it comes to learning about race. Whether we are a person of color or someone who is white, we need to do our own work as we're working with teenagers. I'm so glad we get to have this engaging conversation with none other than the hosts of the Red Couch podcast, Dr. Alma Zaragoza-Petty and Propaganda. Alma and Prop, thank you for being on our FYI podcast.
Yeah, man, what an honor.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. Well, for those of you who may not know, Propaganda is a poet, political activist, husband, father, academic, and MC. And then Dr. Alma Zaragoza-Petty, it's so fabulous how you are also an author and an activist, plus you're an adjunct faculty instructor at the University of Southern California, where you teach grad level equity and diversity courses. And part of why we wanted to have you two on the podcast is you have a deep love for young people and you spend time with young people. So Alma, for years you've been working with young adults in transitioning higher education. Prop, you were a high school teacher. I would have loved to have been in that classroom, let me just say. What a blast. So in the midst of the theme of this podcast today, which is talking about race, what do you see when it comes to how and what young people are talking about when it comes to race and ethnicity?
For me, I think one of the things that come up a lot and that I mentor folks around is our capacity as people of color in showing up for others in the room and taking care of ourselves. I think that often, we can be in a very hard place as people of color in terms of racism and just things that we're encountering either personally or in our communities. And sometimes I think the lines get a little blurred when we are also Christians or people of faith in terms of, being available, being willing, being open. And I think that it's a disservice sometimes to not also consider that sometimes we just need to be quiet and take care of ourselves. And that's okay. We don't need to always be the person that answers the question, or that feels they're talking, they must be addressing it to me because it's about this, or feel any kind of obligation to be the one to sort of, really dive into that very deep and maybe distressing conversation, especially if like you're not in a good place. Like, I think we need more honoring of time for ourselves and our own healing so that we can show up with love, so that we can show up with patience, understanding, curiosity.
Because that's what I found with kids.
Yeah.
Is that like they're balancing that like role and obligation to show up for each other at the same time, also understand themselves and take care of themselves and worry about their own mental health and stuff like that. To me, that's what seems front of mind with them. And I think what's so interesting, at least with folks we work with, is they actually understand that they have mental health issues. Like, that was something that we didn't know we did. And if we did, it was an attitude of like, well, you just gotta suck it up. Life is hard. So I find that like they are like aware that you need both. What I find myself doing is kind of leading in a way of being like, man, it's, both those things can be true. It's okay to take a break. You ain't got to go to every protest, because that's what I felt. The weight of revolution was solely on my shoulders, and it's like, well, no, it's a collective effort that your kids will most likely will also be fighting.
You're right. They are far more willing to admit their struggles, to acknowledge those, to say, hey, I'm not okay. I need a break. And when they can do that, they're more healthy, and we become more healthy as we start doing that too. So while we're thinking about our own health, a major theme of what we wanted to talk to you about today is the way that we as adults, as youth leaders, as parents, as mentors, the way that we need to engage in our own anti-racism work, the way that we need to be a part of decolonizing. And so, those are two big words I just used there, anti-racism and decolonizing or decolonization. Can the two of you unpack those words a bit, and especially what it means for a leader to do that inner work?
When you're talking about at least decolonization, it's just about what are you centering as plumb line and as the norm. This is center line, what we're striving for, and everything else is either ancillary or ethnic or exotic. You know what I'm saying? Like a good way to look at it is your choice of food. You're going to go to an ethnic restaurant. Well, are all restaurants ethnic? Like this, you know what I'm saying? So,
yeah. Hamburgers are ethnic.
That's ethnic. Yeah. So in saying that, what you're saying is, without saying it, is that white is normal and everything else is other. And that is a colonial thought. Whoever powers that be came in and set the standard for what is correct, what is right, what is true, and what is beautiful. We often say like, well, this is biblical. And you're like, oh, well, okay, according to across the world and across centuries and across multiple nations and languages and tribes and communities, we've all been trying to put our eyes on this text and trying to understand the person of Christ. And we've all have participated in the process of trying to interpret and live out our faith. And so to decolonize is to say that, like, I'm not ignoring Eurocentric thoughts. I'm just not centering it. It is not what is normal and everything else is other. It's one of many ways to look at and understand your beliefs.
That was great.
Oh, all right.
I feel like that was both colloquial and also academic.
Yeah. So maybe we could go to the second word that we wanted to unpack. And that, anti-racism.
I think like it's one thing to be like, to use maybe a less charged example, but to walk by a street sign or something and be like, I think that sign's broken, or that sign shouldn't work that way, and then to keep going. And then, but the next step is to be like, so then what should be there instead? Let me go over there, take that down, and rebuild something else. So, and a lot of times when you think about racism, it's easy for us to be like, yo, that's trash. You shouldn't act like that. That law, that practice is racist. Cool. Okay, but the next step in anti-racism is saying, okay, so what are we going to do different? How am I going to actively disengage with that practice and re-engage with a newer practice?
Yeah. So there's that proactivity that's involved in anti-racism. So as we think about our time with teenagers and young adults, I mean, part of what I love about young people today is they're really comfortable about talking about most anything, including race and ethnicity and prejudice and racism. Sometimes those of us over 30, we're a little bit anxious, especially if we feel like we're supposed to solve the problem and we don't know how to solve the problem that young people are aware of. So what would you want us to do as adults to really give space for young people to share what they're feeling, thinking, wondering about? What are some of the things we should be doing?
One important thing we can do is not react. I think often when we react, we immediately are signaling, this is not a safe space for you to respond, to have questions, to learn, to have insecurities. This is and so I think reacting can be very damaging, especially working with teenagers and younger adults, because they're still learning about who they are as a person, right? And so when they immediately get shut down, and that lack of empathy is there, I think it speaks so loudly to them. So I think one thing is just being curious. There's one of the things that I wanted to mention earlier was this idea of anti-racism as being a co-conspirator versus just an ally. And the reason why we don't want to be allies is because that is akin to having sympathy for people who are in a situation versus empathy for people who are in a situation, which requires us to have an internal sort of compass and guidance for action against those situations. And so, I think taking on sort of the mentality of being lifelong learners and also being examples of that to younger youth can really speak volumes, right? When we're able to accept that, hey, we are not always right. Hey, I am learning. I constantly, I'm still, one of the biggest things that I'm still sort of learning is how to not misgender people. When they have told me what they identify as, not allowing my biases and my own sort of reactionary ways of seeing that person in their space and place as this type of gender, and actually gendering them the way they want to be gendered. And I still, I struggle with that, and I am open about it because I know that this work is a lifelong journey of being a co-conspirators and not a one-time thing. I'm going to show up at a rally and I did my anti-work racism, but it's a lifelong work and I'm going to mess up. I'm going to learn and relearn, and things are going to change. And rather than being upset that I don't know what the latest blah, blah, blah is, saying I
don't know what y'all are. Yeah.
Yeah. Taking on an attitude of wow, okay, there's a reframing, a relearning that needs to happen. Because that's what has to happen when we have centered certain populations for so long, is that we're going to keep learning. We're going to keep understanding different ways of sort of interacting with one another that feels true to who we are.
And it's also really relevant to how we mentor and pastor young people too.
Yeah.
So, Alma, I love that Prop says you read a lot of books. You not only read books, you write books,
yes.
Which is so crazy impressive. So tell us a little bit about your most recent book. We'd love to hear about it, please.
Yes. So I Actually, it's my first book I've written for the general public. I wrote a dissertation, but I wouldn't recommend anyone to read that.
Yeah, not many people read that. Yeah, I hear you. Same with mine.
Yeah. So it's called Chingona, Owning Your Inner Badass for Healing and Justice. It's got bad words in there. Sorry, listeners.
And Alma, you actually have a book launch celebration coming up.
I do, yes.
Yeah, we want to hear more about that. Can you tell us, please?
It's going to be in Los Angeles. It's a free event. I wanted to have folks, be able to access this in my community. It's going to be in Lincoln Heights. And November 5th from 12 to 5. There's a lot of info on my socials about it and registering and all that. But yeah, it's going to be a big party to celebrate the launch of the book, my birthday month, not being stuck inside because of COVID, all of the things. I have stuff to catch up to, okay? So I'm going to have mariachi, folklorico dancers, all of it. But yeah, it's really a book about multi-generational or intergenerational trauma and healing. So beyond trauma, and beyond sort of some of the colonial oppression that we have felt as people of color, we meaning Latinas and then also other women of color, there's also like vibrant, exciting healing that happens in our communities. And I think that that's not talked about enough. And so my book really takes this word of Chingona and reclaims it. It's a word that's akin to like being a unwanted person, child, it's kind of like what I guess in English would be called like a bastard or something, and where it could be nowadays, like people will use that as like, what is this, the 18th century? Like no one uses that anymore. But in some communities, it's still like very problematic, right? Wording of like, why do we define people about, based on their patriarchal lineage or whatever, right? So you could kind of think about it that way as well. And so similarly with Chingona, it has very violent colonial roots in terms of the name and what it means, which I discuss in the book. And it also has become a word that has been used and reclaimed by Latinas across many different communities to really empower one another, basically to say, we are changing our circumstances. We're actively doing what we can to heal ourselves, heal others. And what would it mean to take on that kind of a term in terms of our own growth? Like, what if you were Chingona about your growth? What would that mean, And so that's what I dive into in my book. A lot of it has to do with my own personal experience, healing from a lot of racial trauma in my own graduate program and in other spaces, but also, like professional spaces, but also just in my family and some of the ways that I know, there was generational trauma that kept getting passed down and wanting something different for my own kids and something better for my own kids.
So, you used the phrase a couple times, multi-generational trauma. And I think some people hear that and know immediately what you mean. And others hear that and are kind of scratching their heads wondering what you mean. So yeah, would you mind unpacking that just a little bit more, please?
Sure. I mean, from a social perspective, I mean, there's research that even shows biologically how we can inherit just markers in our DNA that predispose us to certain things. But from like a social perspective, I am a daughter of alcoholics. So one of the things that I needed to really come to terms with was, how has that impacted not only the way that adults showed up for me in my own life, but also the ways that I'm showing up for others in my life? How have I sort of, because of this trauma, this intergenerational trauma that has happened, which, may not be that's sort of like, if we're using sort of pathology as like a way to understand this, like, it's not even it's a symptom. It's not even the root of an issue, right? This is just a symptom that has happened in my family because of other factors. Some of those have been, chronic poverty. Like I've come from a very poor background, especially in my parents kind of growing up, walking around barefoot in the hills of Acapulco was very common, and just, things that we didn't see that as chronically in poverty, right? Like we just saw that as like in my case, it was like very exciting as a child to have that much freedom and to be able to like just play with dirt and frogs as like instead of dolls. But then you see someone that way, or I see someone that way now, and I'm just like, oh wow, that was really like I needed some more than that, right? As a child, I needed more than that.
So, Prop, when I've seen you perform, it's normally been before youth leaders, and those are most of the people listening to this. So what do you think we as youth leaders tend to grasp well when it comes to talking about race or racial justice or anti-racism? And what are some of youth leaders' blind spots?
At least in my experience around urban areas, which when I am talking to youth leaders, it's usually in an urban context, subtext being like, people of color or people that have no problem working with people of color. I find that youth leaders understand that it's part of your Christian walk, that this is a biblical issue, your witness, your ability to be effective in the church. And it's like, yeah, you can't be racist, dog. Like, that's a theological problem. Youth leaders have no problem with that. Where they struggle with is that the answer is not necessarily a doctrinal answer. I find that they often try to answer that issue with theological or doctrinal answers. And I think that's oftentimes to avoid getting air quotes political, which is, impossible. I think it's that. I think oftentimes like they're for fear of losing, the family or access to the parents. I think that like youth leaders find themselves being a little more careful in the way that they're doing that. But I think ultimately, like, it seems like there's this disconnect of like, if our children want to get involved in the political process, protests, that's somehow going to draw them away from the faith. That's what I see, rather than what they're saying to us as leaders is like, well, no, this is an outpour of it. It's not going to pull me out. You just told me that this is a theological issue. If I am going to be a follower of Jesus, I need to care about this. And the kids went, bet, okay, let's go do that. And then the leaders are going, wait. And it's like, well, nah, fool, you just, that's the next step. It's that disconnect to where it's like, no, go with them. They want to go to that march, go with them. You don't have to create anything. It's already happening. Like, just go there. That's the disconnect, is like, you understand fully aware that this is an issue of your faith, but the idea that you answer it by a Bible study, I don't think you understand. That's not how you answer that.
Yeah. I appreciate you giving us as youth leaders, I think, appropriate credit for seeing that racial justice and discipleship or faith formation go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Like, I do think you're right. Like, we're quicker than average to recognize that.
Yeah.
But we don't always then leave the room, so to speak. As I think about leaders who are either leaders of color or leaders who are white, how, if at all, do those next out of the room steps need to be different? What's the same? Like, can you break it down even more practically? And like I said, if there are any differences for leaders who are white, maybe working with a predominantly white dominant culture, youth ministry, versus leaders who are people of color working with more people of color.
This is the part that makes me say, I don't envy you. Well, I'm an artist. But I would say, going back to like my my teaching practices, when I was teaching high school, it was around the time that there was a couple like immigration, sort of issues. Our students got very energized to participate in the political process at the time, and they wanted to stage a walkout. And my answer was, well, we'll go with you. It was that simple. Sure, let's go. There's a way that you can allow them, again, going back to like, look, this is y'all's world. Putting the onus back into their corner of like, rather than me feeling like I have to create the program, like they can, they're more plugged in than we are, so they know what's happening. They know who's what, who's this. And in some sense, it's like, yeah, bring me suggestions. What, Are there any demonstrations? Can we go to City Hall? Can we sit in on the school board meetings? Like, you don't like what's happening at schools? Go to school board meetings then. All right, cool. Let's go. Ultimately, whether you're, white or a person of color, I think a good posture is always being like, in this situation, like, yo, let them lead. They're more tapped in than you are. You may come from a broader church whose congregation, may not, or overall leadership may not be down for stuff like this. I mean, I'm like, man, I don't know. Sometimes you just got to like, take that L,
I was going to say, working with, DEI professionals and, through the class that I teach, one of the things that we talk about is finding your community. If you are not in a community that is supporting you in that way, then you find your community. And I think it's especially important for white leaders in any field to find their community if they want to be co-conspirators in terms of, anti-racism work, finding who you can process with those questions that make you self-conscious, that you don't want to ask in front of people of color because you don't know if they have the emotional capacity for you, or they just, you don't know if you don't want to trigger anyone, or just out of respect, like not having others do your work. I think it's so important to have that community of other white folks that you can talk through those things with, and how you would react and what you would say, so that when you are in those spaces, you are not for the first time trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and it is not sustainable if you're not putting in those boundaries around like your community and your own time to just process and heal and be able to regroup, so I really encourage folks to find those communities.
That's great. This has been such a rich dialogue. And Alma, I'm glad you are pointing us to community and to discussion. And one of the things that we talk about in our guide, talking about race with teenagers, is how important it is to swap out language. That sometimes we're very well-intentioned, but we use language that is really not ideal. And so as part of this season, we're ending each podcast by asking our wonderful friends who are guests, what language have they swapped out? What's a term that you used to use, or a phrase that you used to use that you've replaced with something that seems to be more generative and more helpful? Does a word or a phrase come to mind for one or both of you?
I know for me, something that I've tried to swap out, it's not a specific term, but it's war language whenever I'm just in violent language, whenever I want to make a point. Like, let me take a stab at it. Let's not take stabs at anything. Let's not kill two birds with one stone. Why are we so violent? Like, chill.
Yeah, why are we killing birds to begin with, right? Yeah, for sure.
I mean, sure, maybe at one point that's how we ate, but still, So I just try to be very mindful of how much violent imagery I use, because we are such a violent nation. And sometimes I scare myself when I say things, and I'm just like, wow, there was a better way to say that.
Good.
For sure. That's good. How about you, Prop?
My journey is much more around like gender and being the learner, rather than saying stuff like, yo, I'm gonna let you have that. I'm gonna let you speak. Like, you don't need my permission. I don't need to police or lord over what you're saying or meaning to say. One thing I have let go of is that so this is all kind of an outpour of that is willing to kind of be like, you tell me, and taking that attitude to every sort of discussion. In for example, my wife being like first gen Mexican, like she may have no problem with like Latino and Latina. You know what I mean? Some people will be like, but knowing that she don't represent every Latino and Latina, like I may need to like step in with this next person to be like, yo, are you like, is it Latina? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, what are we using? You know what I'm saying? And not feeling like I need to hold any of it. You know what I'm saying? And be like, yeah, you tell me. So I think for me, like in these conversations, like I'm gonna let you, and again, I'm exactly, but I'm like, that's what I'm trying to get away from. But being like, well, I'm just gonna ask, like, You tell me, and feeling no like, well, I don't know what that means. That sounds silly because it's this. So that doesn't even make sense. Like, well, doesn't have to, man.
Yeah,
like, it's okay.
That's really good. Prop and Alma, I so appreciate how you have been deep and practical. You've given us the why, but also the how. And folks, if you want to keep learning from Prop and Alma, then please visit their podcast, the Red Couch Podcast, or look for ways to connect with them in show notes. Thanks so much for lending us your time and your expertise, and may God continue to guide your steps, Prop and Alma.
Oh, thank you.
Blessings. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
If you want to read more about the original language to swap ideas, you can actually find them in the ministry toolkit Talking About Race with Teenagers. It's linked in our show notes. You can find us, the Fuller Youth Institute, on social media for more content and videos and to stay up to date on all the latest research we're doing. Thanks so much for listening. And finally, here is one final thought from a young person.
I mean, at church, I feel like I belong there. I mean, everyone there is like, Indonesian, everything. That's why I try to do my best to go there every Sunday and, be with my other Indonesian friends and stuff like that. It's my only source of culture from over there, because everywhere else, aside from church, like there's nothing Indonesian, well, aside from my household. But yeah, it's like the only place I can relate to other people on a more ethnic, cultural level.